Hello and welcome to the next YouTube video on my channel. Have you ever played a chess game in which you have started with the white chess pieces with pawn to e4 and your opponent didn't answer with a classical and boring move like for example pawn to e5, but rather with the move with his knight on f6 attacking your pawn? Well, if not, I expect you to either be a beginner in chess or you just can't remember a game, because I think that every intermediate chess player has at least once witnessed the very interesting Alekhine's defense. Starting with these two moves named after the famous Russian and French chess player and the fourth world chess champion Alexander Alekhine. So the main principle of the Alekhine is to allow white to advance and push pawns in the center of the chessboard with the idea to attack them later. While it's not played very often at grandmaster level, it's still a very solid opening for chess beginners and intermediate chess players. In this video I would like to show you the most popular lines, also called continuation variations, of this defense after the key moves, starting with the most famous variation, which is advancing the pawn here now on e5, attacking our opponent's knight on f6. Here the normal variation continues with just the knight escaping on d5, and now our pawn on e5 is weak. Therefore we support and defend our pawn by playing pawn to d4. With his knight finally being safe, the black army can start to put pressure on white's center occupation. The most aggressive move here is just straight up pawn to d6, attacking our opponent's pawn here on e5. And here for white it's unwise to instantly capture black's pawn. Pretty more interesting is the very aggressive move pawn to c4, attacking our opponent's knight on d5 now at the second time. And here the only reasonable escape for the knight is to move on b6, attacking the already defended pawn on c4. And here we have to actually be careful, because if we now play something careless, something useless, like for example the move pawn to h3, then our opponent could just capture our pawn on e5, we capture back with our d-pawn, and now they can take out our queen with their queen with check, forcing our king to take back and leading us to not being able to do the very important castling anymore in this game. Here now two main variations exist if we don't play for example h3. And the first one is the very interesting and very aggressive 4 pawns attack, with white playing pawns to f4, completely occupying the center of the chessboard with 4 pawns. And now black definitely wants to destroy this huge center from distance. For example, bishop to f5 is played, placing the bishop here, pretty interesting, inside this pawn structure, or pawn to g6, preparing a fianchetto by moving the bishop on g7, and so on and so on. But we can also just start with capturing our pawn, capturing our opponent's pawn here on e5. Here we obviously don't capture back with the d-pawn, because it's just the same thing. Here black can take out our queen, we have to capture back, and we can't do the very important castling anymore in this game, so we can't bring our king safe behind this pawn wall, and we can't bring the rook anymore in the center of the chessboard as fast as in the castling. Therefore we obviously capture back here now with the f-pawn, and there are many different variations now. For example, developing the knight here on c6 is played pretty often, because now our opponent attacks our d4 pawn with the second chess piece, and we are only defending it once with our queen. Therefore bishop to e3 is played very often to defend this pawn now. The second main variation in this position, instead of the 4 pawns attack with pawn to f4, is the exchange variation. How the name already says, we just capture black's pawn on d6 with our e-pawn, and here our opponent has to decide whether he wants to take out or capture back our pawn now with his c-pawn or with his e-pawn. And here it's just like that. that capturing with the c pawn and keeping the tension and presence in the center of the chessboard is just way more popular. And here we have to be a bit patient, because now our opponent will start attacking our pawns here, because now we still have a bit of a spatial advantage in the center of the chessboard. Here we also have to start developing our chess pieces, because now we are like pretty much in the debut of the chess game and we still haven't moved a single chess piece yet. Therefore we start with knight to c3. And here our opponent has to be a bit careful with attacking our pawns in our center of the chessboard. With, for example, knight to c6, because here they will have to deal with an even stronger pawn on d5. Therefore, black, in most of the times in this position, plays pawn to g6, preparing a fianchetto here on the king side of the chessboard. So now you have witnessed the main lines of the Alekhine defense. But there are of course also lots of different interesting sidelines. My favorite one is Lasker's attack, named after the famous German chess player and second official chessboard master Emanuel Lasker. Here, after the knight has escaped on d5, we don't continue with d4 with the main line, but rather instantly now with pawn to c4, attacking our opponent's knight on d5 with this for the second time now. And I like to play this variation of the Alekhine defense, or the Lasker attack, because I can basically just develop my pawns and build up a strong center while the opponent's knight is running away from my pawns. So here the knight again escapes on b6, and we could actually just go over now to the main line again by playing pawn to d4, but the very interesting and aggressive move pawn to c5 is also possible, because now the knight has to move back on d5, and we just continue with natural developing moves, like for example bishop to c4, attacking our opponent's knight again, or also knight to c3, here with the idea to probably also make a knight trade. Another very interesting and sharp sideline of the Alekhine is the Krejcik variation, where we don't play pawn to e5 in this position, attacking our opponent's knight on f6, but we rather play bishop to c4. Very interesting, because at first it probably seems like a gambit, but actually it's not, because if our opponent decides, well, that's just a free pawn on e4 and captures it with his knight, then we can just win it back with a crazy move, because the move now is the sacrifice of our bishop by taking out black's pawn on f7 with our bishop, attacking our opponent's king, forcing him to take back, obviously, because, well, this is the only legal move. Now, queen to h5 check, and among the 4 different legal moves, here I think that king to e6 and king to f6 are not really playable. And here, after king to g7, we play queen to d5 check, pawn e6 blocks, and we just capture our opponent's knight, and the position is equal again, but just that we have a way better position because our opponent's king is randomly just on g7. And if in this position our opponent doesn't escape with the king on g7, but rather plays pawn to g6 to block the check, it's just the same thing again after queen to d5. So this was it then already with this video, in which I have shown you the many different continuation variations of the very strong Alekhine defense. I hope that you liked this video. If you liked it, feel free to leave a like, then subscribe to my YouTube channel. Till next time, bye!